The laughter at the long mahogany dinner table froze the moment Daniel spat, right on his wife's plate. His family gasped, some pretending not to see, others smirking in quiet approval. They'd always seen Ava as the outsider, the black woman who didn't belong in their world of inherited money and whispered arrogance. But as Daniel wiped his mouth and sneered, Ava didn't flinch. Her eyes, calm and unreadable, lingered on him like a storm waiting to break. Because what no one at that table knew, not his smug mother, not his entitled sister, not even Daniel himself, was that Ava quietly owned 90% of the company that fed every person sitting there. And tonight, she'd stopped pretending to be small. The evening had begun like every other formal dinner in the Williams mansion, cold, expensive, and drenched in pretense. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the long dining table, their light reflecting off polished silverware and perfectly folded napkins. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was a picture of wealth, harmony, and refinement. But for Ava Williams, it was just another performance. Ava sat at the far end of the table beside her husband, Daniel. The heir to the Williams empire, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the state. The family had built its fortune over 3 generations, each one prouder and colder than the last. They liked to think of themselves as legacy, the kind of people who believed money purified everything, even cruelty. Ava, on the other hand, had built her life from nothing. She was the daughter of a single mother who cleaned offices after hours, and it was in those fluorescent-lit hallways that Ava learned resilience, dignity, and silence. She'd studied harder than anyone expected, worked twice as long, and climbed from intern to executive before the Williams family ever noticed her. Ironically, it was her intelligence that had saved their collapsing firm years ago, back when Daniel was too busy living off his family name to notice his company was drowning in debt, yet none of that mattered. Tonight, Daniel's mother, Eleanor Williams, led the dinner conversation with the same sharpness she used to carve her steak. "It's good to have everyone here," she said, her voice smooth but venomous. "Especially our dear Ava. I do hope you're finding your place in the family at last." Ava smiled faintly. She'd learned not to react to Eleanor's barbed comments. Every dinner felt like a test, a quiet interrogation of her worth, her appearance, her manners. They didn't want her here. They only tolerated her because Daniel insisted she made him look progressive. "Of course, Mother," Daniel replied with a hollow chuckle. "Ava's adjusting well. Aren't you, darling?" Ava nodded, eyes lowered. "Perfectly." But behind her calm smile, her mind was elsewhere, on numbers, reports, and the quiet decisions she'd been making for months. The Williams Company was technically still in Daniel's name, but the truth was far more complicated. Quietly, strategically, Ava had acquired majority control, shares transferred under subsidiaries, silent investors who owed her favors, and discreet buyouts no one in the family had noticed. On paper, Daniel was the CEO. In reality, Ava owned them all, the room filled with the clinking of cutlery. Eleanor went on about family legacies and maintaining purity of tradition, while Daniel's sister, Caroline, scrolled through her phone, occasionally smirking at private messages. The servants moved silently, pouring wine, refilling plates, invisible as ghosts. Ava could feel the weight of every gaze, every laugh that wasn't meant for her, every subtle glance at her skin tone, her accent, her background. Yet she sat upright, composed, regal even. There was power in silence. She'd learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was rarely the strongest. Then Daniel leaned close and whispered, his breath tinged with wine. "Try smiling more, Ava. You look too serious." Her lips twitched. "Maybe that's because I am," he chuckled. "You know, my mother's right. You still don't quite fit here." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but tonight, something about his tone burned deeper. It wasn't just arrogance. It was disdain. A kind of quiet cruelty that came from knowing he could humiliate her and get away with it. Ava turned her gaze toward the end of the table, where a painting of Daniel's grandfather hung, staring down in judgment, as though watching the play unfold again and again through generations. "Maybe I'm not supposed to fit," she said softly. Daniel raised his glass, smirking. "Maybe you're not." And then, as if on cue, The first real insult of the night came, not from Eleanor, not from Caroline, but from Daniel himself. "So, darling," he said loudly, turning toward her so the entire table could hear, "I was telling everyone about that little charity project you're working on." "What was it again?" "Oh, right, the one for the kids in the inner city. Such a noble hobby." Laughter rippled through the table, polite, restrained, cruel. Eleanor covered her mouth, pretending to cough. Caroline snorted into her wineglass. Ava's fork paused mid-air. Hobby. That hobby had just built 20 new libraries in underserved communities and funded scholarships for over 300 children. But she didn't defend herself. "Not yet," she smiled lightly. "Yes, it's going well." Daniel's smirk deepened. "Of course it is. It's adorable, really. You trying to save the world one book at a time?" And then, as if to punctuate his mockery, he leaned back, looked her dead in the eye, and spat on her plate. The sound was small, almost delicate. But it echoed louder than thunder. The table fell silent. Someone gasped. The servants froze mid-step. Ava stared at the plate for a long second, then lifted her gaze slowly toward Daniel. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled. "Are you done?" He laughed, nervous, forced. "Oh, come on, it was a joke. Don't make that face." But Ava's face was unreadable. Only her eyes, sharp, steady, betrayed the storm beginning to form, because she wasn't planning to argue. She was planning to end an era. The silence after the spit was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Daniel's mother was the first to recover, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "Daniel," she said sharply, her tone half-heartedly scolding. That's no way to behave at dinner." But her lips curved upward almost imperceptibly, betraying a secret satisfaction. Eleanor Williams had never liked Ava, and this public humiliation was a quiet victory she wouldn't dare admit. Daniel chuckled, brushing off the tension. "Relax, everyone. It's just a joke." He poured himself another glass of wine, the dark liquid glinting under the chandelier's glow. Ava didn't move. Her stillness unnerved even the servants. Caroline leaned forward, smirking. "Honestly, Ava, you shouldn't take things so seriously. Daniel's just being Daniel." "Yes," Eleanor added sweetly. "In this family, we don't dwell on little things." Little things. Ava almost smiled. That's what they called her pain. Her humiliation. Her existence. She had spent years shrinking herself to fit into this family's golden cage, biting her tongue, lowering her tone, softening her truth. But at that table, staring at the man she once loved and the people who mocked her, Ava realized something vital. She was done being small. Her phone buzzed softly under the table, a message from her assistant, Leah. "All contracts finalized. Transfer confirmed." Ava's thumb brushed over the screen for a brief second before locking it again. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smug and self-assured. "See, Ava doesn't mind," he said to his family. "She knows her place, her place." 2 words that burned hotter than fire. The servants began clearing the dishes, their eyes darting nervously toward Ava. Some had worked for the family long enough to know that she wasn't like the rest. She spoke to them kindly, remembered their names, even asked about their families. They respected her quietly, though they'd never dare show it. As the dessert plates arrived, Daniel's father, Richard Williams, the patriarch himself, finally spoke. "So, Ava," he began in a tone that oozed false politeness, "I hear you've been advising Daniel on company matters again. I must say it's admirable that you take such an interest. Though, of course, financial strategy is a bit beyond most women's understanding." Ava tilted her head, her face expressionless. "Is that so?" He nodded, mistaking her calm for compliance. Yes. Our family has managed this company for decades, and Daniel will continue that legacy. It's not something easily understood by outsiders. That word, outsider. It had followed Ava her entire life. From classrooms where she was the only black girl in the room, to boardrooms where her ideas were stolen and repackaged by men with louder voices and paler skin. She had fought her entire life to sit at this table. But tonight, she realized, she no longer wanted a seat here. She wanted the table itself. Ava took a slow sip of her wine, her fingers steady. "You're right, Richard," she said softly. "It's not easily understood by outsiders. But then again, sometimes the ones outside see what those inside never do." Richard frowned, uncertain how to respond. Daniel smirked again, feeling the attention shift. "See, Father? That's what I love about her. Always got something clever to say." Ava's eyes flicked to him. There was no warmth left in her gaze, just the kind of calm that comes before a storm. She rose from her chair quietly, her movements graceful and deliberate. The room tensed. Everyone watched her, expecting a tearful exit or a dramatic plea. But Ava merely set her napkin down beside her plate and looked at the family one by one. "Do you know what I used to think when I first came here?" she said softly, her voice carrying through the room. "I thought this family stood for something. Legacy, honor, hard work." She paused, her gaze landing on Daniel. "But now I see it stands for something else entirely. Entitlement dressed as success." Eleanor scoffed. "Oh, please don't start." But Ava continued, her tone unshaken. "You all treat people like stepping stones. Even each other. And you, Daniel." Her voice softened, almost pitying. "You think you built your life, but every inch of it stands on the work of others. You've never created anything of your own. You inherited your family's arrogance, and nothing else." Daniel slammed his glass down. "That's enough, Ava." Daniel's face turned pale as he stared at the document spread out in front of him. The soft flicker of the chandelier light danced over the golden ink of the Williams crest at the top of each page. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, flipping through the papers, his voice trembling slightly. Ava stood calmly beside him, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "It's everything you signed," she said softly. "Every merger, every contract, every clause you told me to just handle because you didn't have time to read the fine print." He shook his head, laughing nervously. "You're lying." "You can't." "I can," she interrupted, her tone cutting through the room's tension. "And I did." Daniel's mother, Eleanor, leaned forward, her face tight with disbelief. "Ava, whatever game you're playing, stop it now. You think you can just take our company?" Ava turned to her, eyes cool and sharp. "Your company?" she repeated, almost amused. "You haven't worked a day in your life for that company. You've lived off its profits and off the backs of people who actually build something." Caroline scoffed. "Oh, please. You married into this family. You don't own it." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "You're right," she said calmly. "I didn't just marry into it. I rebuilt it." The room went silent again. Ava walked slowly around the table, her heels echoing on the marble floor. "When Daniel nearly bankrupted Williams Global, I was the one who brought in new investors. I was the one who negotiated the contracts that saved your name. You all celebrated his genius, but you never once asked how it happened." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying you did it behind my back?" Ava stopped behind him, her voice low and steady. "No, Daniel. I did it for us. But you were too busy showing off to notice whose signature was really saving your empire." She turned toward the table. "Each transfer was legal. Each document was reviewed. And each gave me one thing you didn't think mattered: voting rights. Quietly, slowly, over 3 years, I accumulated them. And as of last quarter, I hold 90% of Williams Global's controlling shares." The words hit like thunder. Eleanor gasped. Caroline covered her mouth. Even Richard, who'd sat in silence all evening, looked stunned. Daniel rose from his chair, his face red with fury. "You can't do this. I'll sue you." "You'll what?" Ava said softly, stepping closer. "Sue your wife, the one who built your company from the ashes you left behind. You'll sue the legal owner?" Her tone didn't rise. She didn't need to shout. Her calmness was louder than his rage. Daniel's voice cracked. "You think you can humiliate me like this in front of my family?" Ava met his glare, unflinching. "You already humiliated me, Daniel. You just didn't think I'd ever rise high enough for it to matter." For the first time that evening, Daniel's confidence cracked. He looked around the table, seeking support from his family, but none of them spoke. They didn't know what to say. Richard finally broke the silence. "Ava, this is outrageous," he said sternly. "You're a guest in this family, whatever. Disagreements you two have, They don't give you the right to take what's ours. Ava's eyes turned cold. A guest? I was your family for 8 years. I stood by Daniel when the board wanted to remove him. I defended him when the press called him a fraud. And all this time, you treated me like a stranger at your table. But tell me, who's the guest now? Eleanor shot up from her chair. You don't talk to us like that. But Ava's calm expression didn't waver. She turned toward Daniel and whispered, You should have read what you signed. He shoved the papers aside. This isn't over. Ava smiled faintly. Oh, it's far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. The power shift begins over the next few days. Word spread through the Williams Global offices. At first, people didn't believe it. How could Ava, the quiet, graceful wife, be the true owner? But when the official shareholder records were released, shock rippled through the entire company. Daniel arrived at work on Monday morning only to find his access revoked. His name had been quietly removed from the executive boardroom doors. The receptionist, once quick to greet him with a smile, looked away awkwardly as security politely escorted him out. Ava sat in his former office, the corner suite overlooking the city skyline. She wasn't smug. She wasn't gloating. She simply sat with quiet dignity, reviewing reports with her assistant Leah at her side. Are you sure you want to do this publicly? Leah asked softly. Ava nodded. Yes, I want him to understand what it feels like to be invisible. To have his worth dismissed because someone else decided he didn't belong. The next morning, the media broke the story. Headlines flooded the news. Ava Williams secretly acquires. 90% of family empire, husband out of power. The black woman behind Williams. Global's hidden success. The world that once ignored Ava suddenly couldn't. Stop talking about her. Daniel's phone buzzed nonstop, with calls from investors, journalists, and friends, all demanding answers. But the only sound that truly haunted him was Ava's quiet voice at that dinner table saying, You should have read what you signed. At first, Daniel tried to fight back. He hired lawyers, desperate to reclaim control. But every legal path led to the same conclusion. Ava had done everything by the book. The contracts were valid, her ownership airtight. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was trapped by his own negligence. Meanwhile, Ava began restructuring the company. She called meetings with department heads, ensuring that those who had been overlooked or mistreated finally had a voice. She promoted women, people of color, and long-overlooked employees to leadership roles. The boardroom that once echoed with dismissive laughter now thrummed with fresh energy, vision, and respect. But Ava's composure wasn't vengeance. It was justice. And yet, despite her calm exterior, there were nights when she sat alone in her office, staring at the city lights, replaying that dinner scene over and over. The spit on her face wasn't just humiliation. It was a symbol of everything she had endured silently. And deep down, she knew Daniel wasn't finished. Not yet. The confrontation a week later, Daniel stormed into her office unannounced. His once polished suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. You think you've won? He spat. You think you're some kind of hero now? Ava didn't even look up from her desk. Security let you in? He slammed his fist on the table. Don't play games with me, Ava. You ruined me. She finally raised her gaze, calm but unyielding. No, Daniel. You ruined yourself, he laughed bitterly. You're nothing without me. You needed my name to get here. Ava stood, stepping closer until they were face to face. You're wrong. You needed mine. Daniel blinked, confused. She handed him a document, an official press statement announcing her rebranding of the company. The Williams logo was gone. In its place, A Global Holdings, no family name. No legacy of arrogance, she said softly. Just work that speaks for itself. His voice dropped to a whisper. You're erasing me. Ava looked at him, sadness flickering briefly in her eyes. No, Daniel. I'm freeing myself. For a moment, he looked almost broken, like the proud man had finally realized the depth of his loss. But then his jaw tightened again. You'll regret this. Ava tilted her head. I already regretted giving you my loyalty. Now I've given myself something better. Freedom. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and left, slamming the door so hard the glass trembled. Ava stood still for a moment, then exhaled slowly, finally feeling the weight lift. The beginning of her empire months passed. Ava's company flourished. Investors admired her vision, her discipline, and her authenticity. The same people who once ignored her now sought her partnership. And while Daniel faded quietly from the public eye, his reputation ruined, Ava grew into something larger than anyone expected. But she never bragged. When asked in interviews about her rise, she simply said, "Sometimes, silence builds the loudest legacy," and in a way, it did. The night outside was heavy with rain, the kind that poured against the glass like 1,000 whispers of unfinished stories. Inside the penthouse, Ava sat by the window, her reflection blending into the storm. She had done what she once thought impossible. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her worth. But peace was fragile. And she could sense it. She hadn't heard from Daniel in weeks. No calls, no lawsuits, no public appearances, just silence. And in that silence, Ava sensed a storm brewing, not of thunder, but of desperation. Leah, her assistant, walked in quietly. "Ma'am, we've received an alert from the finance team. Someone tried to access your private accounts. The breach came from Daniel's old login." Ava exhaled slowly, staring out into the rain. "I knew he wouldn't go quietly," she murmured. The last gambit at midnight, the call came through. A familiar voice. "Daniels. I just want to talk," he said. His tone was calm, too calm. "Meet me at the old house, the one in Rosewood Heights. You owe me that much." Ava hesitated. Every instinct told her not to go. But there was something in his voice. Not anger, not even regret. But something hollow, she agreed. When she arrived, the mansion stood like a ghost from a former life. The grand pillars, the manicured garden, the marble steps that had once echoed with laughter. But now it was dark. She pushed open the door. Inside, the faint scent of whiskey and old cologne filled the air. The living room was dimly lit by the fireplace, where Daniel stood, hands clasped behind his back. "You look good," he said quietly. "Different." Ava stood tall, her coat dripping rain onto the marble floor. "You said you wanted to talk." He smiled faintly. "I wanted to see if you still had a heart," she frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel turned toward her, eyes red-rimmed and tired. "You took everything from me, Ava. My name, my company, my family's respect, everything. I took back what was mine," she said firmly. "You're the one who destroyed everything else." He walked closer, his tone trembling between anger and despair. "Do you even remember who we used to be? Before the boardrooms, before the money, before all this pride?" Ava's eyes softened, just slightly. "I remember," she whispered. "But that man is gone." He laughed bitterly. "No, he's still here. You just buried him under your power trip." Ava's voice stayed calm. "You buried yourself the moment you spat on me in front of your family." "That wasn't a slip, Daniel. That was who you really were." Daniel's face twisted in guilt and rage. "You think you're a saint now? You think all this money makes you better than me?" "No," she said, voice low. "It made me realize I never needed you." For a moment, silence. The fire crackled between them, then Daniel snapped. "You don't get to rewrite history!" he shouted. "I built this. I carried you." Ava didn't flinch. "Then why did I end up carrying the weight of your failures?" He glared at her, chest heaving. "You always needed to be the victim." Ava's lips curved slightly. "No, I just stopped being one." The shattering moment, Daniel grabbed a photo frame from the table, their wedding picture, and hurled it into the fire. The glass shattered, flames swallowing the image of two smiling faces from another lifetime. "You see that?" he shouted. "That's what you've done to us." Ava's eyes glistened, but she didn't move. "I didn't burn it, Daniel." "You did." He stepped closer, trembling. "I loved you, Ava." She shook her head slowly. "You loved control. You loved the idea of being the man on top. You didn't love me, not the woman who challenged you, not the woman who refused to bow." He stared at her for a long, broken moment. Then his shoulders slumped. "Then I have nothing left." Ava's voice softened. "You had everything, Daniel. You just never valued it." The final betrayal. Suddenly, Daniel reached for his pocket. Ava's breath caught. but instead of a weapon he pulled out a small USB drive. "I still have one card left," he said quietly. "Financial records, private emails, deals you made without disclosure. If I release this, you'll lose everything." Ava's face remained unreadable. "You won't. Try me," he said, smirking weakly. "You think the world worships you now, but they'll turn on you the second they smell blood." Ava slowly stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "If I've learned one thing, Daniel, it's that power isn't what you own. It's what you can survive losing." He blinked, confused. She held out her hand. "Give me the drive." He hesitated, then laughed bitterly. "You really think I'll just hand it over?" Ava sighed. "No, I think you'll destroy yourself with it, just like you destroyed everything else." Then, with quiet finality, she turned and walked toward the door. Daniel shouted after her, "You'll regret walking away from me." Ava paused, her silhouette framed in the doorway. "I already regret ever standing behind you." Then she left. The fall, the next morning, the headlines were brutal. Daniel Williams arrested for insider trading. Disgraced heir exposed after attempted extortion. Ava didn't have to lift a finger. The files Daniel had threatened her with? He'd tried to sell them to a rival company, not realizing the deal was a government sting operation. The empire he once lorded over had turned its back on him. And yet, Ava didn't celebrate. She simply stood in her office, looking out at the skyline, her reflection strong and steady against the glass. Leah entered quietly. "Ma'am, it's over." "He's gone," Ava nodded. "No," she whispered. "He's just facing what he ran from his whole life. Himself." The morning after, months later, Ava attended a community conference where she announced a foundation dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs, especially women of color, who had been silenced or underestimated in corporate spaces. The applause that followed wasn't loud and chaotic. It was steady, heartfelt, a rhythm of recognition, respect, and hope. In that moment, Ava didn't see a boardroom or a title. She saw freedom. After the event, as she walked to her car, a young black woman approached her shyly. "Mrs. Williams, Miss Ava, thank you," she said, "for showing us that we can be powerful without losing grace." Ava smiled softly. "Never let anyone tell you that silence means weakness. Sometimes it's the space before your greatest roar." The woman nodded tearfully, and Ava walked away, heels clicking on the pavement. Shoulders straight, eyes calm, the true victory back at home. Ava stood on her balcony overlooking the city. The wind carried the faint hum of traffic. The world moving forward. She closed her eyes, remembering that dinner table, the laughter, the humiliation, and how it had all led to this moment of quiet power. She whispered to herself, almost smiling, "He spat on me to shame me." I rose to remind him what grace looks like, and with that, she turned off her phone, sipped her tea, and watched the dawn spread over the skyline she now ruled, not through revenge, but through rebirth. The following months felt like a lifetime reborn. Ava had spent years living in someone else's shadow, Daniel's charm, Daniel's ambition, Daniel's lies, but now, she was finally living in her own light. The empire that once bore his name had been restructured and renamed Arden Global. The name came from Ava's late grandmother, Evelyn Arden, the woman who had raised her after her parents passed, and who always told her, "Power means nothing if you can't use it to lift someone else." That became the heart of Ava's mission. Ava moved out of the cold glass penthouse that Daniel once bragged about and into a modest yet elegant townhouse near the city gardens. The walls were warm, filled with sunlight and soft music instead of silence and tension. Each morning, she walked through her new home barefoot, a cup of coffee in her hand, and a quiet smile on her face, the kind that comes not from wealth but from peace. People began to see her differently. Once dismissed as the trophy wife who got lucky, she was now Ava Arden, the woman who rebuilt an empire with integrity. Interviews poured in from major networks. Business schools invited her to speak about leadership and resilience, but Ava always declined the flashy spots. Instead, she launched Project Second Breath, a mentorship program for women who had lost everything, women divorced, abandoned, betrayed, or overlooked. She wanted to teach them what she had learned the hard way, that your worth isn't defined by who hurt you, but by how you heal. One autumn afternoon, Ava was invited to a global economic forum in London. She stood on stage in a simple white suit, elegant, unassuming, powerful. The moderator introduced her as the woman who redefined grace under fire. Ava took the microphone, paused for a heartbeat, and began. For years, I believed that silence was survival, that staying small would keep the peace. But silence only feeds those who thrive on your stillness. I learned that grace doesn't mean shrinking. It means standing tall even when you're shaking inside. The hall erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from people who feel seen. After the speech, reporters surrounded her, asking if she had any regrets about what happened with Daniel. Ava smiled faintly. Regret? She said softly. No, pain taught me what peace never could. Daniel, meanwhile, had fallen completely. He was sentenced to a short prison term for financial fraud and extortion. The once celebrated heir was now a tabloid cautionary tale, a man who lost everything because he couldn't bear the idea of a woman standing taller than him. One day, Ava received a letter with no return address. Inside, a single line written in Daniel's handwriting, "You were always the stronger one." Ava stared at the letter for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it inside her drawer. There was no anger left, only understanding. He had finally said the one thing she needed to hear, even if it came too late. Years passed. Arden Global grew into one of the most ethical, female-led corporations in the country. It prioritized fairness, mental health, and transparency, everything Daniel's empire had ignored. But Ava never let success cloud her purpose. In interviews, she often said, "My greatest revenge wasn't taking control of the company. It was becoming the woman I was never allowed to be." She became a symbol, not of bitterness, but of rebirth. Her image began appearing in magazines with headlines like, "The Rise of Ava Arden, From Betrayal to Boardroom Brilliance, When Power Learns to Heal." Still, she never forgot where she came from, or who she was before the money, before the mansion, before the scandal. One quiet Sunday, Ava drove back to her old neighborhood, the place where she grew up barefoot, chasing dragonflies between brick walls and dusty streets. The kids recognized her immediately. "Miss Ava, you're the lady from TV," one shouted, running toward her. She laughed softly, kneeling to their level. "No, sweetheart. I'm just Ava from the block." She handed the little girl a sapling wrapped in cloth. "Here, plant this. When it grows, remember that you can too." The child smiled, eyes wide. "I will." As Ava stood and looked around, she realized that this, not the applause, not the wealth, not the headlines, was what she'd been working toward. The quiet power of impact. Later that evening, Ava returned home. She stood in front of her mirror, the same mirror where she once questioned her worth, her beauty, her strength. Now her reflection smiled back, not flawless, but real. She whispered to herself, "You didn't just survive him. You outgrew him." Leah entered the room holding a new proposal folder. "Ma'am, this just came in. An investor wants to partner with you for international expansion." Ava smiled. "Tell them yes, but only if they understand this is about legacy, not ego." Leah nodded. "Always, ma'am." As her assistant left, Ava walked to her balcony once more. The city lights shimmered like scattered jewels beneath the night sky. She took a deep breath and let the wind carry away the last traces of her past. Months later, during a charity gala, the host played a short documentary on Ava's journey. The footage showed clips of her community centers, scholarships, and foundation work. The narrator's voice said, "In a world that tried to break her, she built bridges. In a system that doubted her, she redefined what power looks like." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Ava didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because she had already cried all the tears her past deserved. When asked to give a few words, she said, "If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be this. One day, they'll try to silence you with shame. Don't answer with anger. Answer with excellence." And the hall fell silent, a silence filled not with pity but respect. That night, Ava returned home and opened the balcony doors. The city hummed below, alive, imperfect, real. She held the letter Daniel had once sent her, read it one last time, and finally tore it in half. The pieces drifted into the night, carried away by the wind, taking with them the last remnants of a man who had once mistaken her kindness for weakness. As dawn began to paint the sky, Ava whispered to herself, "I forgive you. Not for you, but for me." She turned, closed the balcony door, and smiled. Her scars were no longer marks of pain, they were medals of survival. And for the first time in her life, Ava didn't feel like she had something to prove. She simply was. Months later, Forbes released its annual list of the 50 most influential women of the decade. Ava Arden's name was number 1. But when journalists called to congratulate her, she only said one thing. "Don't remember me for what I achieved. Remember me for what I refuse to become." And with that, Ava hung up, walked into her garden, and watched the morning light fall over the city, a woman finally free, finally whole, and finally home in her own story. Absolutely. Here's a powerful alternate ending to The Black Woman Who Owned Everything He Took for Granted, rewritten to land with deep emotion, redemption, and a strong moral lesson that resonates long after the video ends. This version closes Ava's story not just with revenge, but with wisdom, forgiveness, and triumph through grace. Years later, long after Daniel's name had faded from headlines and gossip circles, Ava sat beneath a quiet oak tree at the center of her foundation's campus, the House of Renewal. Around her, dozens of women worked, laughed, and learned. Some were young mothers rebuilding their lives, others survivors of broken homes or shattered trust. Each of them had one thing in common. They had been told they were less than, and now they were learning they were enough. Ava watched a young woman nervously practicing a speech at the podium nearby. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone bright. Ava smiled. She recognized that same flicker she once saw in her own reflection, the moment a woman starts believing she deserves better. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. A child's laughter echoed somewhere in the courtyard. Ava closed her eyes and exhaled, feeling the peace she had once thought she'd never find. Then a familiar voice broke her thoughts. "Mrs. Arden?" She turned. Leah, her loyal assistant and now the foundation's director, held an envelope. "It came for you this morning," she said softly. Ava took it, her fingers brushing over the handwriting. It was from Daniel. For a long moment she simply stared at the name. The man who once spat on her at dinner. The man who tried to destroy her confidence, her dignity, her spirit. The man who had forced her to learn the cost of silence and the value of strength. She unfolded the letter slowly. The paper was worn, the ink slightly smudged. "Ava, I watched an interview of yours last month. You spoke about forgiveness, and it made me realize what I never saw before. You didn't just win, Ava, you grew. I broke everything we had, but you rebuilt it into something I couldn't even imagine. I hope wherever you are, you've found peace. I hope you know I'm sorry. Daniel." Ava's eyes lingered on the words, then softened. There was no anger left, not even sadness. Just closure. She folded the letter once more, stood up, and walked toward the small memorial fountain at the edge of the courtyard. On its base were engraved her grandmother's words. "Power is not what you take from others. It's what you give back to the world." She placed the letter in the water. The ink began to dissolve, fading into ripples that shimmered in the sunlight. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of his name. Ava stood on the stage of the new community center her foundation had built, a glass-walled, light-filled space called the Second Sunrise Center. The crowd was full of women, families, students, and journalists. The air buzzed with anticipation. Ava stepped to the microphone, her calm confidence commanding every eye. "Once upon a time," she began, "I thought power meant control. But now I understand real power is peace. It's choosing grace when anger feels easier. It's standing tall when others try to shrink you. And it's forgiving, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve freedom." The audience rose to their feet, clapping, some wiping away tears. As the applause swelled, Ava looked toward the back of the hall where a group of young women, the next generation of leaders, watched her with awe. In their eyes, she saw something beautiful: hope. That night, Ava wrote the last line in her personal journal, the one she'd started the day she walked out of Daniel's house. Revenge may silence an enemy, but forgiveness silences your pain. She closed the book, placed it on her nightstand, and smiled. The world had called her a victim once. Now she was a teacher, a builder, a healer, because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in destroying what broke you, but in becoming stronger, softer, and wiser because of it. True power isn't measured by how loudly you rise after being broken, but by how gently you lift others once you've healed.